Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Goblins and Growlers Podcast. I'm Josh Maltby at Black Cloak DM, mostly on Discord.
I'm Brandon Dingus at Way of Brandalore, probably just on Instagram and Discord because I realized I don't really care for social media all that much anymore. I tried Threads for a while and it just ended up devolving into garbage, and that's why I don't want to try Blue Sky.
Yeah, I've had a better experience with Blue Sky than I've had recently with Twitter, but I haven't had a good enough experience to be like, I'm going to put a lot of effort into creating a platform for myself here.
No. And speaking of platforms that we have, I want to throw a frustration out just immediately that was not on our show notes, but I was just thinking about this. You may or may not have read in the Goblins and Growlers Gazette newsletter that I put out last month that I was very excited for this game, City of Six Moons, that was coming out. It was like a single player storytelling game where you have to decode. Yeah, just for anybody who didn't see that, it's like you have to. The whole game is written in an alien language, and you have to decode the language and try and figure out what it is. And the creator of the game has said they're never going to explain any of it. So part of the charm is you're never going to know if you really sort of understood the rules or the goals or anything like that. So this was last month, right? It was May, and they're like, okay, it's coming out in June. So I was on their website just every day, just like F5ing every morning to see if they'd finally released it, because they never said what day they were going to release it, just that it was coming out in June. And then I got really busy for like 3 or 4 days, and I think it was like Sunday. It was Monday or Sunday of this week when I was like, oh yeah, I should probably go check on that because I really want to go order that. And I go back to the tab, which I left open and just ignored, and I refresh on it. And I was furious because it says that it's sold out, and it says temporarily out of stock while we wait for additional wooden pieces to arrive from Germany. Like, I'll make my own wooden pieces. Just let me buy the damn game, please. I've been looking forward to this for a while. But I will. I'll drop the link to it in the show notes of this episode just so other folks can check it out. But it looks really cool.
You know what would be hilarious to me is if after publication of this episode, a bunch of people reach out and they were like, oh yeah, I got it because you recommended it in the newsletter.
Come on!
No! Hoisted by my own petard.
Yeah. But I say that only as sort of a sly promotion of our own internal content. If you want to be able to share in frustrations like these, just go to our link tree and subscribe to the Goblins and Growlers Gazette monthly newsletter that is not a hassle or anything. And usually there's nothing in there trying to get you to buy anything. It's just me saying, here's some stuff that I thought was interesting on the indie scene. And also here's the TLDR on stuff that went on our podcast in case you don't want to listen to all of them, but maybe you should. But anyways, that was just the promo I wanted to throw out there up front, just mainly because I was just frustrated that I'm not going to be able to play that game this weekend.
That's fair. That's totally fair.
Yeah.
That is linktr.ee/goblins and growlers for anyone who's not watching the video and can see the beautiful banner that we have up. We'll also have it in the show notes.
Yeah.
All right. Let's get into business. So first and foremost, we had a very significant comment in the Discord, and you know us. We like to call out the folks who spend a lot of time writing down all of their thoughts on a subject. This is from Rushbolt, parentheses, Parath, who was talking about all of the things we had said about Kobold Press and specifically Tales of the Valiant and my frustrations therein.
Long time and probably even short time listeners at this point are very familiar with our opinions on how Tales of the Valiant shook out.
Yeah. So Rushbolt, I'm not going to quote the entire thing because Rushbolt wrote quite a bit. I'm just going to hit kind of the highlights. If you want to see the entire thing, join the Discord. It's still up in the G&G podcast channel, and then you can add your own thoughts to this conversation. Rushbolt says they never really stated it was going to be radically different than 5e, and goes on to kind of discuss how mostly it was an idea to keep 5e alive even as WotC was pulling the ripcord on 5e. And I generally agree with that, but I also know what Kobold Press is capable of. And so it's like, don't say we're keeping 5e 5e, because that's not interesting. That's
Yeah.
do
And
your thing with it.
and I think there's a lot of truth in what Rushbolt is saying there. However, that doesn't really take away from the fact that that when Black Flag was rolling out, and of course, this was in the middle of everything that was going on. Kobold Press was like, it's going to be a whole new experience, and I don't know how to read that. I don't know how to parse that other than we're going to make it sort of like very different. Maybe even giving a little bit of credit there. Maybe that doesn't mean radically different, but I expected some more significant differences than what we got. And we've ad infinitum, we've been over like all the reasons for why they said that versus why they actually did the thing and everything. Please go back and listen to those episodes if you just want to hear like not necessarily old men, but men rant like old men about this.
He goes on to actually, you know what? I'm assuming they go on to talk about how they don't like they're not saying they like how Kobold Press ended up basically printing what seems like 90% of the SRD again and calling it a new game, but they're not sure if KP anticipated the sheer volume of work they took on with the limited staff they had available. And I think this is a fair point. It took Wizards of the Coast a long time and a lot of design and a lot of iteration and a lot of changes and a lot of playtesting to get 5e to become 5e. I would argue, though, that Kobold Press they're not making an entirely new system. They are still using 5e as a platform to launch off of. My frustration is Kobold Press is not a teeny tiny group with teeny tiny resources. They're a full-size third-party publisher that's been publishing very successfully for decades now.
Yeah.
They absolutely have the resources to do more than they have done so far.
But
now,
I'll go ahead.
I haven't reviewed a lot of the stuff that's in the TOV books themselves fully published and released. So it's possible that once I get into those, I'll be like, you know what? This is what I was looking for. I just thought you were going to do more of this in your SRD as well.
Yeah, and I think part of this that maybe we've overlooked too is when everything was going on last year with the OGL stuff and all these announcements and plans were being made, like Kobold Press probably thought they had much longer of a lead time to do something with this, because let's say history played out differently, right? And Wizards does not put OGL into Creative Commons. All of a sudden, Kobold Press went from feeling like, okay, they're gonna take the open SRD away from D&D, so people are going to be for a while trying to figure some stuff out. So we've got some lead time to actually come up with this new system. And then after 30 days, when the rug got pulled out from under, when Wizards wisely was like, hey, let's put this out in Creative Commons, Kobold Press is like, well, we got to do something. Like, we've made all this noise. We have to do something. We have to do it quickly. And so they did probably the most expeditious thing that they could. And I feel like, we were talking about this before we started recording, and it goes into the next part of Rushbolt's comment. But I feel like in that alternate universe, instead of people making a lot of noise about DC20 coming out, we would be hearing the same thing about whatever Tales of the Valiant was originally conceived as being. And maybe it never got much further than some ideas in the heads of people at Kobold Press, but they were probably thinking something more along the lines of a deconstruction and a reconstruction like DC20. So yeah, in that alternate universe, we're probably seeing things a little bit differently, where Kobold Press got to do what they'd initially envisioned.
Right. And the next thing that Rushbolt says is, it would be a daring move, but I would like to see new Kobold Press products only state that they are for Tales of the Valiant and not even mention 5e compatibility. I don't think we're going to see that.
No.
I don't think, with 5e being in Creative Commons now, Kobold Press doesn't really have incentive to move away from 5e as a structure. I I agree that it would be a very daring move and it would be very interesting to see how it plays out. But I think from a business standpoint, I think that hurts Kobold Press in a way that they don't want it to, and may not even have the resources to do in any effective way. Now, maybe with a Tales of the Valiant 2, kind of like Pathfinder 2 breaking away from 4 or 3.5 altogether. It's possible. I certainly wouldn't rule it out for the future, but I don't think their supplemental stuff is going to be like, nope, we don't do 5e anymore. We just do Tales of the Valiant. At the very least, not in this current generation of books.
Yeah, there's just too many there's too many economic factors that play into that. Like whether anybody likes it or not, 5e is the foundation of the table. It is the bedrock of the tabletop hobby. And like you can like that or you can not like that, but I think the only thing you can't do is disagree with that, because then you're being disingenuous. So there's, and like you were saying, with it being in Creative Commons, like there's absolutely no incentive to step away from that, because the loudest people in this who are like, never WotC again, are also like probably a very small group within a very small group that is the niche of our hobby.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's getting that worked up already has a lot invested in the hobby at large. It's unlikely that they are the folks who are representing, I would say, even 90% of the fan base. And then finally, we close out on kind of a hopeful note in that Rushbolt says, I hope that KP continues to evolve Black Flag. And then there's a little bit between, and then even just a TOV variation where they use their own spells and monsters would be interesting to me. And this, I highlighted this because it hits something that I think is very core to why I'm as irritable as I am about this whole situation. They have entire books of monsters, entire books of spells, and I think they've even got like subclasses and things like that. And they didn't integrate all of that into their SRD. They're still keeping those things to the side, expecting that you will buy those older books. They could have taken the original Tome of Monsters and put in several of those as SRD monsters instead of using the Wizards of the Coast 5e SRD monsters.
I think from their perspective, though, it's just all about protecting their IP, because we saw where, when Wizards was putting stuff out into Creative Commons, they made mistakes. Like the name Beholder is in Creative Commons now, and Strahd von Zarovich is in Creative Commons. Like not all of it, but enough of it that it's annoying. And I would say there probably is an economic incentive from the perspective of Kobold Press to just be like, well, okay, like WotC gave us this foundation in Creative Commons, so let's just essentially republish that. And then if like Rushbolt is saying, a TOV variation where they use their own spells and monsters would be interesting to me. Well, would it be interesting enough to you to buy it? Because that's what they're hoping. Like, that's why they're not putting that stuff out in SRD. Yeah.
I think for me, though, the gamble of taking some of their old content and turning it into something that's accessible for free so that you start using their system more than WotC's system, to me, that's an economic gamble worth taking. I think saying, oh, we don't work with 5e anymore. If you want to play our stuff, you have to use Tales of the Valiant. I think that's bold and also dangerous from an economic standpoint.
Yeah.
But books that they published 5-10 years ago that probably are still selling copies, but probably aren't selling tons of copies, have a decent chunk of that monster set go into the SRD, the Black Flag SRD. I think that pays off for them in the long run. Now, I'm not an economist, so I don't know that for absolute certain, but that's kind of my leaning on this. And I think I do want to get myself a copy of Tales of the Valiant, and I do want to review it so that I can actually have a complete opinion on the situation, as opposed to what I have right now, which is I'm not a big fan of their SRD because it's not as different as I hoped it would be. And I know that they're going to keep doing 5e compatible stuff because it just makes business sense to do so.
Right.
That's what I've got for now.
Yeah. And I'll just comment on something you said a second ago, and then we can blessedly move on. But talking about like, oh, you should start incorporating some of that stuff into the SRD. Like, I would look at it from the perspective of, if I've got this thing that's free and anybody can use it, and all I have to do is maybe tweak 5 to 10% of it and just turn it around and find a way for people to pay me $60 for it, I'm going to do that before I do the work of perhaps doing stat block conversion, spell conversion, taking stuff that I could just remonetize and sell before I start incorporating it into that. Like, I'm going to do less work up front to sort of gauge interest in whatever this is. And then at that point, I'll see what I want to convert over, what I want to adapt. And maybe with a version 2 of their Black Flag resource document, they can incorporate some of that stuff to when they need a burst of interest being generated for it. Like, it's like, don't shoot your shot the first time out. Like, make sure, like right now they're just sort of taking a test of the appetite on some of it. And they're doing that in the most low cost way possible by essentially taking the Creative Commons SRD from WotC and putting it in a new binder.
The final thing I will say on this, because I know we're trying to move on, is that I would argue that by not differentiating more, they've given people less reason to convert.
They're banking on people being upset with WotC. They're banking on people being burned out with WotC. That's their differentiator right now. And they're going to need to expand from that relatively soon. But that was what they were trying to do to get people. That was their plan to get people on the bandwagon of TOV. Yeah. And I don't have any numbers in front of me, but I would imagine that it's not working as much as they would have hoped when they came up with this plan for Tales of the Valiant.
Well, and I think that is, as we keep saying, I think that is the context that is required here, is that when they first came up with this scheme, everybody was like, WotC is being garbage, we hate them, we want them gone, we will do whatever we have to move to a different system because of the OGL business. And then when WotC went, hey, you know what, we'll put 5e in Creative Commons, that changed the tone of everything so rapidly that Kobold Press had to pivot, because that if WotC had not backed down from that and had been like, no, we're going forward with this, if you all want to produce stuff for us, then you owe us money, then I think Kobold Press doing basically 90% 5e, but you don't have to support WotC in any way to be part of it.
Yeah,
I think that works for them in that world.
Yeah. So if you're tired of listening to us talk about this, give us a 5-star review on your podcatcher of choice. If you're going to give us less than a 5-star review, reach out to us and we'll try and talk you into that 5-star review. Also, if you'd love to hear us talk more about this, also give us a 5-star review. We'll just parse the comments on the reviews.
Yeah, we'll figure it out from what the 5-star reviews say.
Yeah.
So there's something in the middle of what Rushbolt was saying that I kind of glanced over as we were doing quotes, because it takes us into our next topic very neatly. So I wanted to save that segue. If you want a game that takes 5e and tries to make improvements everywhere, then you are looking for DC20. Which takes me to our main topic of the day, which is a little bit of a state of TTRPGs. So, as you and I very frequently say, Wizards of the Coast remains the 5,000-pound gorilla in the room. There's not a whole lot you can do to dethrone them, at the very least not swiftly. Which does make me that much more irritated every time I see someone create a YouTube video that says, is new system currently crowdfunding the new D&D killer? And it's like, nothing has ever been the D&D killer.
Yeah.
Please stop saying these things.
Let me again complain about all the YouTube video titles I saw that were like, D&D is at the end of its life. Like, D&D is hurting. Shut up. Shut up. And then when I called the person on it, they just literally were like, if I didn't put titles like that on my videos, nobody would watch them. And you know what? Respect to you for your honesty. I disagree with your motives, but I respect that you're transparent about them.
If there's one thing BuzzFeed taught us, it's that a good title gets clicks.
Uh-huh.
So I wanted to talk, when I was initially coming up with this concept, I wanted to do a brief retrospective to kind of open things up. But I think having the conversation we just did about Rushbolt's comments, I think we've had a brief retrospective about recent history in TTRPGs. So I want to jump directly into where are we now? We've had comments in the past about how there's these huge Kickstarters that have gone off, have been massively successful, and we're just not going to see that kind of money in TTRPGs going forward because Wizards of the Coast managed to screw things up so badly that everybody was like, we're going to jump ship, and then remedy things just enough that everybody was like, well, I guess we don't have to jump ship. And so the assumption was the money's not going to be there anymore for these third-party publishers. I went back and I looked at some numbers for some past Kickstarters, backer kits, that sort of thing for different companies. Tales of the Valiant did $1.1 million in backing in May of 2023. The latest Nord Games compatible with 5e book, which is the Ultimate Bestiary Secrets of the Fae, did $141,000 in backing in September of 2023. Flea Mortals, which this, I didn't realize this did quite as well as it's done.
Did from Matt Colville. Of course it did well.
It is Matt Colville, and I did know that it did well, and I knew that it was going to do better than whatever he set his baseline goal as, which I think was like $200,000. Did $4.6 million in backing in January of 2024. Now, I feel like you have to have a Matt Colville level following to get that kind of backing, period. Like, that's just how that works. But you might be surprised to hear that DC20, which we were just talking about, by the Dungeon Coach, is currently, as of recording, sitting at 1.58 million with a week to go as of episode release. So if DC20 is something you haven't heard much about, it's something that's taking a lot of elements from something like 5e and completely remaking them from the ground up.
Yeah, it's like sending 5e to boot camp to be broken down and built back up again. How many backers does that have right now?
You know what? I didn't look at that number, but I can pull that up pretty quickly.
Yeah, that would be some interesting context to it.
It's a lot, though. It's in the, if I recall correctly, the tens of thousands. Yeah, almost 15,000 backers. 14,937 as of recording. Oh, 938.
Okay, so over $100 per.
On average, yes.
Yeah.
And that's impressive given that the base level reward is $30 to just get the PDF.
Yeah. I think that speaks to, well, I want to be careful how I couch this because I don't want to make generalizations. Because again, when we're talking about tabletop, we're talking about a niche. When we talk about like D&D, like that kind of tabletop as opposed to board games, a little bit deeper down the niche. Then we go one level deeper and we're like people who play a lot of tabletop and are looking for non-mainstream systems. One level deeper, people who are willing to put up money for a Kickstarter and gamble on that coming out for an untested system. So we're like several levels deep right now. And it's easy to get seduced by the numbers on a lot of these. Like once you cross like $500,000 on some of these, but let's keep in mind the number of people. Like what constitutes a healthy base for a title is, 15,000 people. Cause let's say that maybe by the end of the 12 day, cause we're recording this like 12 days before it's done. Let's say we get to 20,000. Then like we need to figure out what the market is for that 20,000. Like how much conceivably can they keep monetizing like a percentage of that 20,000, because you're going to have those people are going to be your early adopters who are willing to take a chance. A percentage of those aren't going to like it. A percentage of those are. A percentage of those are going to like it, and they're going to be willing to put more money in it. And I'm sure they've done this analysis and everything. I'm just really curious to see what that represents to them sort of as an ongoing revenue stream. That's the real story about what's thriving and what isn't. The Kickstarter numbers are sort of a great little window into that, but it's a window it's like a bathroom window that you have to squeeze through to be able to start digging deeper into what the longer term numbers are for something like this. Because, like I say this like only slightly with glibness, but like anybody like who can manage their marketing pretty well can have a successful Kickstarter. It's what your opportunity is after that, if you have a longer term goal for a new product line.
Yeah, I think that's part of why I include Nord Games in this list, is because Nord Games has been creating using
Kickstarter's their entire business model.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And they've been creating supplemental material for 5e from get-go, pretty much. So the fact that they're still pulling in a $141,000 Kickstarter for a supplement book that is just going to be creatures and just going to be creatures for the Feywild, that's pretty impressive. Like we're talking about enough money to pay 3 people a living wage. Now, admittedly, that's not covering things like cost, which of course you and I both know printing things takes a decent chunk of money.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's cost. It's variable labor, like your contractors and stuff, and your artists and everything.
Yep.
That's like direct labor is always a little bit of a hidden cost on some of these things. So that's like the living wage you're talking about, but there's just a lot more cost than you would expect once you start getting into that kind of stuff.
Right, and I think last I checked, Nord Games was still a fairly small studio as far as like how many people are regularly employed, how many contractors they bring on to do art and things like that. When you're talking about the niche going even deeper, I think this is one layer below even the people who are looking for something different from mainstream.
Yeah.
This is people who are looking for something different from mainstream and specifically want it to be indie. Like that's that one layer deeper.
I would argue that Nord Games is about as close as you can get to mainstream while still technically being indie. And that's not a knock or anything, because that's like, I think that's literally how they're positioning themselves.
Well, and I think that is the position that they've been able to take, in part because Kobold Press, with everything that happened with the OGL, has moved themselves into a more mainstream position. You're not going to hear people talking about Kobold Press on Little Sheldon or whatever the name of the current Big Bang Theory show is.
It actually ended last month.
Perfect. Timely references from Josh Maltby.
Timely references with 100% definitely absolutely correct names of the show as well.
But my point being, you're not going to hear about it on primetime television shows. That's just not it. Kobold Press is not quite that well known.
Right.
Wizards of the Coast is barely well enough known to get that sort of recognition, and they've worked very hard to get there.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Wizards of the Coast isn't well known either. Their brands are well known. Well, their 2 primary brands are well known, but they're not well known. Like, I could talk to my dad, and he would know what Dungeons and Dragons is, obviously, because I played it when I was a teenager living in his house on his pool table. And he knows what Magic the Gathering is, just because it's been out there for, gosh, like almost 30 years at this point. But if I said, hey, Dad, are you familiar with Wizards of the Coast? He would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
That's fair. I don't think anybody knows Kobold Press by brand name. I don't think they know. And admittedly, part of that may be Tales of the Valiant is the first time they've had a product which was solely theirs.
This is their big swing. If like in 10 years, we'll be able to answer that question. whether or not Tales of the Valiant is sort of up there. And I like, you may like, this may be one of those comments that somebody wants to crucify me for, but like putting it in the same league as like something like, oh gosh, I don't know, I guess like Call of Cthulhu, GURPS, something like that, stuff that's well known in the tabletop sphere. Like the name is at least known by people who play tabletop games. Like, again, my dad would have no idea about Call of Cthulhu or GURPS or anything like that. But you talk to somebody who's been playing D&D for a while, they've probably heard of those kind of things. And, you know, maybe not 10 years, maybe like 3 or 4 or 5 years, we'll really know if Tales of the Valiant has that kind of penetration. But I think the key there is it ultimately different enough from D&D to matter? Because the two things that I just named are very different.
Yeah. I keep getting into fights with people online because our good friends over at Animorphs Anonymous and Dungeons and Draken Beams have convinced me to not only hang out in their Discord, but to join the Animorphs Yerk posting Facebook group. And every time someone talks about anything relating to like, oh, I figured out how to make Animorphs work in D&D, someone jumps in and it's like, D&D is not really the right system for that. You should really be using GURPS. And it's like, get out of here.
GURPS for the Yerks.
Stop doing the nonsense that you are doing. No one asked.
Yeah. I think that's hilarious that you're involved in that Animorphs group. It's
so niche. It's so niche.
Yeah. I'm somewhat significantly older than you. So I remember when I was a teenager, me and my friends would go to the Walden books at the mall. And one of the things we would do is go back to the place where they had all the Animorphs books. And we would just because we were like, number one, dicks, and number two, stupid, and thought we were doing something clever, is we would just take all the Animorphs books and turn them over so the covers were, so it was the back covers. And that was just sort of our way of defiance over the popularity of Animorphs at the time.
You couldn't handle how popular it was.
Yeah, but that's my primary experience with Animorphs, aside from seeing a few episodes of the Nickelodeon show.
Fair. It is for a children's book series, it is dark.
From what I've read, there's like all kinds of nightmarish body horror stuff going on.
It's also like the horrors of war. It's kind of incredible how dark it is. Anyway, before we get too far off on our Russian arcade museum, speaking of niche things, there's also, you know, really, really indie projects like Born from Ice, which we just talked about, which raised $57,000.
And that was by somebody, and that was basically like one guy and a couple of other people working on it. So if we're talking about like, is there still a market for indie tabletop products? Are they going to continue to thrive, or are we outside of that golden era, as that, you know, we posited from that one comment and a few, probably more than a few at this point, episodes back? I think something like Born from Ice really shows that if you have a good idea, yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the keys for what Lauren was doing with that was, it was unique in that it was D&D with no magic system. Like, let's strip away all the decoration from it. Like, that's the one sentence pitch for what it is. It's D&D with no magic system and a bit more survival elements. And then stuff like the generational play that he wrote as sort of part of the system. So, because like, if you look in the Kickstarter comments for it, while the Kickstarter was live, there were some people being like, oh, wait, so there's no magic system? And then Lauren would reply and be like, no, that's not the point. And that person, like, they withdrew their pledge, and he was like, fair play. I totally get it.
That surprises me a little bit, because I hear, wait, there's no magic system, and I'm immediately like, how is this going to work? I'm more curious now than I was before. But I guess some folks are like, but I like magic. I play TTRPGs, so I can do magic.
Yeah, and I think this sort of gets into the thrust of sort of what I feel about this question of where are we now with essentially third-party products. Is I think that probably after Tales of the Valiant, we're not going to see anything terribly successful. And, we can go back and forth on whatever our definition of successful is. I guess right now, the metric I'm using is sort of more qualitative than anything. And it's like, how has it captured sort of the zeitgeist within the niche, right? Like, you can argue that Tales of the Valiant has succeeded from that perspective. And of course, we're divorcing it from any kind of like economic or financial return. Excuse me, any economic or financial returns. But it's, let's call it popular with a lowercase p. It's not like populist, like I guess I would describe Dungeons and Dragons, just because like anybody just picks that up and plays it. But something like Born from Ice, obviously with 57,000, it earned far, far, far less than some of these other projects like DC20, like Tales of the Valiant. But it was scoped as a very niche product. Like, he wasn't looking to raise $1 million on this thing. He was like, he understood his market and he understood what he needed to shoot for on this. So I think that's going to be successful.
I agree.
Like, if you have it, it's like wrestling. If you have a good gimmick, you'll get over. You need to have a good gimmick, but you can't just come out and be just standard wrestler, with like a different pair of trunks on or something like that. Which, if we see, like, if there's some other copycat of like Tales of the Valiant or something like that, that's what it'll be. Tales of the Valiant, the only reason it's not being labeled too much like that is because it was first out of the gate on this. But
that's fair.
Other people start doing it, it's going to start looking like copycats. But then let's dig into that a little bit more. I know I was talking earlier about how overall Kickstarter numbers don't really matter all that much, but let's look at Hit Point Press's Floral Dragons, which was the most popular darling in the last month or so in the community. Because I had like at least three people independently ask me if I'd seen Floral Dragons and what did I think about it. I think it's really cool. I think it is, and this sounds worse than I mean it, but just give me a chance to explain it. I think it's nothing special in that, okay, it's a dragon bestiary, right? But they had a really good gimmick for this dragon bestiary, and it's like something that we haven't seen before. Like, there's all kinds of like metallic dragons and chromatic dragons and gem dragons and stuff like that. Flower dragons, okay, that's pretty awesome, and I'm interested in this. It's interesting too that they raised 1.1 million for their Kickstarter for this one bestiary book. And obviously there are a couple of other things in it beyond just the bestiary element, but that's primarily what it is. And it's interesting to compare that to the Tales of the Valiant Kickstarter, which also raised 1.1 million. One is a source book that is intended to jumpstart an entire ecosystem of a new game system. And one is just a really, really cool niche bestiary from one of the more creative, probably the most creative third-party publisher out there right now. I really have a lot of respect for Hit Point Press. They do a lot of cool and interesting stuff. Like we talked about Heckna, and also, we're fans of Humblewood over here. So they do really interesting stuff. They also had 3,000 more backers for Floral Dragons than Tales of the Valiant had, which I think is the more relevant number. And I think that speaks to how much more universally applicable that is. So I think the future of these kind of things is taking something that's built on a 5e foundation, but having just a really cool gimmick with it. That's, I think, the only way the economics make sense. I don't think DC20 is going to be too terribly popular or lucrative. Obviously, it's made a lot of money out of the gate, but like, how much are we going to remember that 5-10 years from now?
I mean, I think that depends. If they are doing all of the things out of the gate that we thought that Black Flag was going to do, maybe they see greater success for that. Because people who have already backed Black Flag and are now like, I'm disappointed with what I'm seeing, I need to pivot. Do they then spend their money with DC20 instead?
But were we getting people who were doing sort of rage backing and frustration backing, or like people who write in no chance candidates, right, when they vote? Like they're backing Tales of the Valiant not because they support it, but because they just want to try to create a viable alternative for D&D. I think that we are, let's see, because and you said there were like 15,000 backers on there, right? So I think that's already a better sign for it than Tales of the Valiant. But if they're indeed breaking down the 5e system and rebuilding the play mechanics, like largely from scratch, and Rushbolt talked about this in their comment too, it's like they're really going to have to do a lot of play testing on that to determine if this stuff is going to be super viable long term. And I think that's where the problem is. That's where we're going to run into issues, because Kickstarter ends. They've made like, $1.7 million in upfront funds on this. And I'm just extrapolating. That's just a guess. We'll find out in 12 days. And
right.
And they then have to get really into the hard work of the production of it and the play testing. I'm sure they've done some already, and they probably, if they know what they're doing, have a pretty good idea of what their mechanics are going to look like. But things are different on paper than they are actually on the table. So we'll have to see what that is. I'm sort of losing the thread of my point here a little bit, but it's that I think my overall thesis here is success in this space is going to come from smaller scale projects that have a good spin on the 5e formula rather than stuff that's coming out whole cloth. Because I think there's also just a real there's an antipathy, there's an unwillingness, there's a bit of being jaded with a new system. Like, it's just exhausting to think about learning a new system. And it's so much easier to be like, and I say this from my own experience, like Born for Mice, I'm like, this is great. Because I was actually like thinking over the last couple years about trying to write a similar sort of early hominid caveman system. And I was just trying to work out how all the mechanics of it work. And it was exhausting. And I can only imagine how exhausting it would be for somebody to learn what I was trying to come up with there. And then, like I told Lauren, I was like, you have done this, so now I can stop working on it. Thank you. Thank you. Because it's in a language that I understand.
Yeah.
And that's, and maybe that's going to be something that DC20 can lean on, right? Maybe we look at, maybe 5e is Latin, right? And then everything else is just a Romance language. And you may not understand everything about whatever system is. Let's just say DC20 is analogous to Spanish or something like that. Right. You may not understand all of it, but you're going to be able to relate to it a little bit because you understand the underpinnings of it. But it depends on how much they rewrite it.
I think that is a big factor. I think that DC20 will kind of be the teller on what you are surmising. Mm-hmm. Whether or not an indie project can come in and go, hey, you know what? We understand that this is what you're familiar with. We're pushing that to the side because we have something new that we think you'll enjoy. Mm-hmm. If DC20 can successfully break the mold and hold on to folks and hold their interest and grow kind of its own fan base, if DC20 in 5 or 10 years, we talk about it the same way we talk about something like Powered by the Apocalypse, mm-hmm. where you might not know it outside of the hobby, but if you've been in the hobby for a couple of years, you've at least heard of this system.
I'll call that a win, but it's also good to be sort of in the same league as PBTA. There's also going to have to be a really, I guess I'm going to call it fourth party, like a real fourth party community that's essentially powered by DC20 in the same way there is with Powered by the Apocalypse.
That's kind of my... For them to truly succeed, we need to see people who are invested enough to go, this is great. There are things I want to do with this that are specific that you aren't creating that I can create under license from you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the telltale sign of whether something has holding power mm-hmm. or if it's going to be something that's really cool, but ultimately fades over time.
Has DC20 said whether or not they're going to release under an open SRD?
I don't know enough about DC20. You know, that actually might be a good topic for next time, is to mm-hmm. talk about DC20 at large, learn some more about it from the perspective of us being TTRPG journalism types. And find out more about it and then talk about it in the sense of what is the system going to be like? What are we expecting from it? Are they going to have their own OGL? Like, what does all of that look like? Because I think it could be radically successful. But as we have both said, at the moment, it's a very successful Kickstarter. Whether it's a very successful system remains to be seen.
Yeah. And, I just thought of this while we were talking, but, really for any new system that comes out that's trying to be sort of a capital S system on the scale of like Tales of the Valiant and DC20, which I think everybody understands the distinction I'm trying to make. I think going forward, none of them, like, unless you have an open SRD, you will not be successful unless you give people the ability to publish under your SRD on your new system. You're going to have to, and also like the success of some of these systems really just sort of hinges on marketing, right? Because like with a movie, if it costs $150 million to make, you also have to figure that there's $150 million in the marketing budget for the film. So it's got to make back $300 million, even though it only cost $150 million to make. I think with these new systems, like there's such a high bar that they have to cross to just get out there in the consciousness of the hobby, that it's going to depend too on how much money that they're putting into marketing. Like it'd be really interesting to know, like, of the 1.58 million that DC20 has now, like how much of that are they earmarking for the marketing of the product? Because that's going to be probably more important, honestly, than the actual contents and the mechanics.
You might very well be right there. I can't say for certain.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, nobody can. Time is the only time will answer. That's all I can say.
Only time and market forces.
Yeah. Real quick, you mentioned market forces. Like we're coming. Let's see. January, February, March, April, May, June. So we're like 10, 11 days from the end of Q2. So we'll be seeing Hasbro's earnings call probably in the first, like somewhere between July 1st and July 30th. Maybe a little bit in the beginning of August. We'll see that, and we'll see where some of the numbers are going on Dungeons and Dragons. Frankly, I feel like as far as releases go, this has been a very lackluster year. That's something we've been talking about since the end of last year. There's no real big marquee thing and you can talk about Vecna, but I just really don't think that the rise of Vecna is coming with the same sort of oomph as some of the other marquee releases we've had in years past. So I'll be really interested to see sort of where things are trending. Obviously, it's a trailing indicator looking at the earnings calls from a previous quarter, but we'll get a sense of like where things were going from like Q4 and then Q1 and then obviously Q2. And that's 3 data points. So that's going to let us see whether or not the trend line's going down, trend line's going up, trend line's staying stable. And it'll allow us to predict a little bit going into the back half of the year. And I think all of that will inform future revenue potential for these third parties, really.
I will say, I think this will be the first quarter that won't have very, very significant quantities of Baldur's Gate 3 money on it.
Oh yeah, they were definitely. I called in to the Q1 earnings call and listened to it, and they, if I remember correctly, they sort of walked right up to the line of being like, "We're starting to see the tailwind of the Baldur's Gate 3 money."
Yeah, because they released it on Xbox this quarter, but Xbox doesn't have a huge console following at the moment. And so I think they'll get some money out of that, certainly, but I think it'll be significantly less than the PC and PS5 releases.
Yeah, once you start getting into all the ports, like the functional development lifecycle for the game is over. And it's just, you're Skyrimming at that point. You're just trying to figure out how many fridges and air conditioners you can release this on to get a little bit more blood from the stone.
Can your fridge play Baldur's Gate 3? Find out.
You open your fridge. Would you like to buy some of my potions and ingredients?
I will say, if they found a way to program your fridge so that it talked to you in the voice of one of the main characters, I think that would sell exceptionally well.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I would love to have the Jarl of Whiterun in Skyrim talking to me in my fridge. That would be fantastic. But yeah, so like we're gonna know a lot more in probably like 5 to 6 weeks about what the state of TTRPG is, because whether we like it or not, like as goes D&D, goes the rest of this segment, really.
I think that's sort of fair. I think there is, as we are seeing in all of these Kickstarters, there's money being spent in other places. It's nowhere near the same amount.
Let me be clear. From a long-term perspective, I think it sort of all hinges on the pop, because as long as D&D stays popular, that's more people getting into tabletop, and as long as more people are getting into tabletop, they're discovering other stuff, and they're going several levels deeper. If D&D starts waning, then in 4 or 5 years, we're going to see probably Tales of the Valiant gets 750,000 instead of 1.1 million. You know, like maybe Floral Dragons only gets 500,000 or something like that.
Maybe. I don't know. This is something that was kind of interesting in a conversation I had last night. We ran the game at Stone, and at my table there was a person who was observing, and I
remember that person.
Opportunity to talk to that person because everybody else got up to grab drinks. I was just hanging out at the table for a little bit, and I was like, "So, you're hanging out, you're observing. How are you enjoying things so far?" And we had a brief conversation about how TTRPGs just aren't really their thing, but their partner's really into TTRPGs, and so they're here to spend time with their partner and be supportive, and also it's kind of fun to just like watch the chaos develop. And I was like, that's totally fair, like 100% reasonable. And we ended up having a brief conversation about TTRPGs as a entertainment segment. And I got the distinct impression from this person that the thing they don't enjoy about TTRPGs is they just don't want to keep track of all that stuff. If they wanted to do something like this, they would want a system that kept track of all of it for them. And D&D Beyond just isn't sufficient for that. And so video games are fine. TTRPGs are like a little much for them.
Well, there's like that system exists. Like it's out there. It's just a matter of convincing your friends to play it.
100%. But kind of the thing that I was getting to with this is that I don't feel like TTRPGs have the same stigma they did, 20 years ago. When I got a campaign together with some friends to play 3.5, and it was like, oh yeah, we're going to do this. Anybody I talked to about it was like, oh, I mean, I knew you were kind of a nerd. I didn't realize you were like a nerd. And I feel like, and maybe this is just the circles I'm rolling in at this point, but I feel like I don't get that sort of feedback from anybody anymore. These days, it's all like, oh, you're doing something like Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Yeah, I saw it on this show, or I heard about it in this podcast, or I saw it on this video. And it's, generally speaking, people, even if they're like, oh, it's not something I think I would be very interested in, they still are like smile and nod, not like, really? That's what you're going to spend your time doing? That's weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so much more, like the key is just getting it more ingrained in the culture, because I remember like 30 years ago, I was a huge Star Trek fan, and this was back when there was really just the original series and Next Generation. And you'd get made fun of if you watch Star Trek, at least in sort of my school, the schools I was in and stuff. But now it's just like Star Trek's kind of everywhere. Like it's not like Star Wars everywhere, but it's kind of everywhere. Like
it's pretty close.
Yeah. And it's just the same thing, I think, with D&D. It's just the more people are exposed to something, the not necessarily cooler it becomes, but just the less other it becomes. And I think that's the key. I don't think it's more popular. I think it's just less stigmatized.
Yeah, I think part of it is people that you think are cool or funny or interesting, seeing them doing tabletop role-playing games as something that they enjoy and have fun with, I think just makes it so that it's not weird for everybody else. Shout out to Critical Role, Stranger Things, and pretty much the entirety of Dropout, but specifically Dimension 20.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a whole lot of very cool people who've been doing tabletop role-playing games and playing them and making videos out of them and showing people that it's not a bunch of greasy nerds eating Cheetos in a basement. It can be, if that's what they want to do, but it's something everybody can enjoy.
Yeah. And, the person you were talking to at the Stone game last night, the one thing I would tell them is, like, you have to sort of actively search for that thing that you want there. Like, you have to find it. And we can talk about the different levels of indie, but, like, as with sort of most things, the most innovation is going to be found. The most innovation and disruption is going to be found in a lot of sort of your smaller scale efforts, because it's easier to be different and to be disruptive when it's just you or you and a friend working on a thing. So you really want to, like, drill down deep, because you're, like, hyper indie games. And by that, I mean the stuff that you're finding on, like, itch.io, the stuff that maybe isn't even published physically. That's where you're going to see your hub of innovation for, like, different kinds of mechanics, really deconstructed mechanics, no mechanics, different ways of doing things, like your 10 candles kind of games. And
yeah,
that's where you really need to dig in if you're trying to find something different, because since Dungeons and Dragons is the underpinning of everything at, let's call it, a quote unquote corporate level of TTRPG, like, it's going to be so much harder to find something different in that, because it's all built on the same ecosystem for a reason, and that reason starts with a $sign.
Yeah. Well, and there's a big difference between you and your buddy with your day jobs, work on this on the evenings, on the weekends, those sorts of things, and you and your team of 10 all have to make rent at the end of the month.
Yeah.
That's significant.
Yeah. I'm thinking a lot about that person that we met at Triad Anime Con that had that game that we've talking about but haven't yet. The really, like, what was it, like a satanic game or something?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember the name of it. I apologize, person, if you're listening to this, but Josh has that on a list of stuff for us to talk about, and we just haven't done it yet. But yeah, like, that's the prime example of a passion project that somebody is just running with. And you may like it, you may not like it, but those are the kind of things that are really worth exploring, because you never know if you're going to find your kind of weird with that kind of thing. But I can guarantee you the place you're not going to find your kind of weird is with a 5e compatible game, basically.
Oh, for absolute certain. Well, I think that pretty much covers. I had been wanting to talk about this for a little bit, because you and I keep talking about it in reference to other things that are happening in the community. And I feel like we never really take the time to fully explore your and my thoughts on the current status of things and where things are going, because I think both of us are fairly optimistic about TTRPGs at large. And sometimes I suspect it sounds like we're like, it's not different enough. They'll never succeed this way. Wizards of the Coast will always have all of the money. I don't know if we do the 1920s gangster voice when we're doing that, but I like to think that we are.
Yeah, the real SRD is in Al Capone's vault.
So thank you for coming along with me, Brandon, on this exploration of TTRPGs at large as an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot to look forward to, and I think there's a lot to be excited about, and I'm really interested to see what we do with what we currently have in the next 5 or 10 years, because I think it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I'm always willing to talk sort of with what I have been told is the unearned confidence of a man of my age and complexion, and sound like a real industry analyst. That's always fun.
I mean, I think there's a certain point. You and I joke a lot about just being a couple of guys who are hanging out and having fun conversations about this stuff and engaging with those conversations with other people. There comes a point where we've been paying enough attention to all of the news and analyzing the news that we are paying attention to, I think we might actually be journalists on TTRPGs at this point.
Yeah.
We're not high quality. We're no J.R. Zambranos.
Yeah.
But we're working on it.
But, one of the things that journalists do is telling people what they need to know. So, Josh, why don't you tell them what they need to know?
Well, for starts, they should go to linktr.ee/goblins and growlers and sign up for the newsletter, because that comes out once a month, has a ton of great info, is a quick read. I think I've yet to see one that you've published that was more than like 10 or 15 minutes at most. And that's when you had like a ton of stuff for people to get into. So we're not talking about picking up a short novel every month. We're talking about picking up a pamphlet every month and getting some hot scoops about things going on in TTRPG world.
Yeah, I always use the average read time for something and then just divide it by how many words can somebody read in a minute. So usually I always try to keep it under a 3-minute read. So you can just scan through it, and if there's something that you find interesting, just click the link.
Yeah. And I find it a really handy repository of what's going on in TTRPGs right this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's monthly. So it captures all of the biggest news. And then if you want more info on what's going on with that, there's the links. Click through.
Yeah. And you can feel really underground by being a subscriber, because we're not like those, some might call them successful newsletters out there with tens of thousands of subscribers. We did just pass a milestone recently, which I won't share, but I'll just say it's well under 1,000.
Yeah,
so
folks.
Get in on the ground floor, and you can tell me the kind of things you want to see in the newsletter, and I'll be happy to put them in there for you.
That's true. That's 100% accurate. Speaking of which, if you want to share that information with us, you should either join the Discord, bit.ly/goblin discord, where Brandon and I are most frequently found in our social media escapades, and can be tagged in the G&G podcast channel, especially when you've got pressing thoughts about something we just said in a podcast. Or you can find us sometimes on social media at Way of Brandalore and at BlackCloakDM. Additionally, you can find Brandon and my voices on the Quid Pro Roll podcast, a narrative play podcast all about bringing metallic dragons back to a world ruled by chromatic dragons.
No floral dragons, though.
No floral dragons yet that we know of. There's always room in the future. And then last, but absolutely not least, Telegraph, Telephone, Tell a Friend about the Goblins and Growlers podcast. A sequence of words that I mix up every time I do it.
You got the thrust of it right, though. That's the important thing.
Because we don't spend money on advertising, because we don't have money to spend on advertising.
That's true.
So you spreading the word about the show is the way that new people find out about us, unless they manage to stumble upon us by wandering the hallways of the internet, which, if that's happening, I would love to hear about it and how it occurred.
Yeah, those people are generally to be found on Samsung Free or Samsung Podcasts. Yeah. But no, we're actually we started this podcast in 2021. Yeah, we started in 2021. Oh yeah, it's in the logo. We started in 2021.
Has it been that long? Oh my
yeah, it
God.
has. It was right before Queen City Anime Con 2021. And I've been very pleased with the steady growth of the audience of this podcast. We recently hit a milestone on downloads that I didn't think was unimaginable, but I was just like, wow, it's going to take us a long time to hit that milestone. And there we are. Less than this, that actually happened probably about 6 months ago. So it was like just over 2 years to get where I thought it would take us a lot longer to get to. But yeah, keep telling people about it. And, we're very accessible. So you can always just hop into the Discord and complain directly at us. We're not like those faceless podcasts out there where you can't interact directly with the creators. I'll tell you right now, Josh will back me up on this. I have had to take a lot of a back seat from the main Goblins and Growlers Discord over the last couple of years, just because of grad school commitments and work and stuff. So I haven't been able to be as plugged in as I want to be. But I'll tell you this, every time somebody asks me, I jump right in there and I'm like, what is, like, somebody's talking about me because I'm a needy person. Like, somebody's talking about me or has a question, I'll jump right in there and give you feedback.
Well, and if you go and look at the Rushbolt conversation, you'll see that I'm in there as Rushbolt is putting thoughts down onto the screen, and I'm contributing to what's being said. So, you know, if you want to engage with the hosts of the show, we're available. We're there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then I imagine we'll have a bumper on here as well. But also, like, check out the May Contain Action podcast network, of which we are a part. There's a lot of cool shows on there, including Forgotten Paths, which is, I think, spinning up its second season right now.
They're currently doing Session 0 scenarios where they're introducing all the new characters kind of on a 1-by-1 basis, which is a cool way to do that. And something I will talk to Alex about potentially doing for QPR Campaign 2. Because it's been fascinating to learn about the characters by listening to an entire episode role-played by the creator of that character and Noah Downs, who's running the podcast.
Yeah. Can I tell you that a couple of weeks ago I had coffee with Noah, and he was very much bragging about doing that and how excited he was for it, and he was showing off all the art. He was showing me on his phone all the art that he was getting ready to put out on social media as part of the lead up to it.
It's a good idea.
Yeah,
I will grant it's a good idea.
Yeah, this was also when we were sitting at a Starbucks and he had his head shaved and an Avatar Last Airbender arrow drawn on it.
He did raise a significant amount of money for sick children that enabled him to shave an arrow into his head for the financial gain of sick children.
I was positive he would be wearing a hat when we met for coffee. I was wrong.
You were incorrect.
I think
incorrect. He takes pride in that. Yeah. I really do.
Yeah. But
so there's a bunch of great shows on the May Contain Action Network. Go and check them out as well, because they're all kind of a big group hug that we're a part of.
Yeah, and I think that's about it.
Yeah. Thank y'all.
We should just end it right there. We should just you just say yeah, and then it just fades to black.
Cut. Thank y'all for joining us. We will see you in a couple of weeks' time, where it sounds like maybe we'll be talking about DC20.
We'll
see if we drum up enough info to feel good about talking about DC20.
Oh, also, speaking of, I was on the phone with Noah Downs Esquire the other day, and he did say he wanted to be on the podcast to talk about stuff. He's like, I'd really like to talk about Forgotten Paths Season 2. I said, I would absolutely love to have you on the podcast, but you have to come with something else other than Forgotten Paths Season 2. He's like, oh, no. I'll come up with something.
Okay. All right. So we might be hearing from Noah Downs in the near future as well.
Yeah, perfect. Exactly.
Perfect.
All right.
All right.
We'll talk to everybody later. Thanks so much.
Bye, y'all. I like my Mountain Dew shaken, not stirred.
Ugh. It's gross.